The luxurious high-rise in Manhattan shone brightly against the dark sky, its facade a glittering beacon of wealth and power. Ethan Pierce, the man who called the top 2 floors of that building home, stood in front of a wall-length window, his silhouette barely moving. He sipped an amber liquid from a crystal glass, savoring its burn while he surveyed his kingdom below. Ethan was not a man to be crossed. At 38, he had built his empire with relentless precision. His fortune, accrued through shrewd investments and ruthless takeovers, was a fortress as much as a mask. On paper, he had it all: fast cars, sprawling estates, a private jet. Yet, the splendor that surrounded him felt like a thin veil, barely concealing an emptiness that gnawed at his insides, a void left behind after his sister, Lila, vanished without a trace when they were just children. The pain of that loss, of never knowing what happened, had hardened him, making his heart an impenetrable fortress. He never allowed vulnerability, and he made sure no one got close enough to see the cracks. The intercom buzzed. Ethan placed the glass down, his sharp blue eyes narrowing. "Mr. Pierce," a crisp voice announced, "the preparations for tomorrow's celebration are complete. Shall I review the final guest list?" Ethan didn't care about guest lists or the meticulously planned festivities meant to dazzle and impress. He had thrown this lavish party, not for himself, but for control, for the reminder that even joy could be orchestrated under his command. "No need," he replied coolly. "Ensure everything is flawless." He turned his back to the view, pacing into the vast living room adorned with art pieces that were more valuable than some people's entire lives. Yet, his gaze fell on none of it. He was fixated on a different kind of presence in his world: Sarah Donovan. Sarah had started working as a maid in his building just 6 months prior. Her arrival had been inconspicuous, her demeanor quietly humble. Yet, she had caught Ethan's attention almost immediately, and he despised himself for it. He couldn't comprehend why a woman so far removed from his universe stirred something raw and unfamiliar inside him. Perhaps that was why he had decided to act out. A power play, to reassure himself that he was untouchable, that no one could reach the deeper, hurting part of him. He demanded her presence at the party. It was irrational, childish, even cruel, but he relished the thought of her discomfort. Would she show up? Would she dare defy him, the man who signed her paychecks? His mind drifted to the possibility, and he caught himself smirking. Sarah Donovan had worked late shifts before, but the tension she felt now was something new. Standing in her modest, 2-room apartment in Queens, she brushed her dark hair back as she watched her daughter, Emily, play with a raggedy teddy bear. Emily's laughter was her grounding force, the reason she got up every morning. But tonight, dread overshadowed the joy. "Mommy," Emily chirped, holding the bear up triumphantly, "Teddy wants to dance too." Sarah forced a smile. "We'll teach Teddy all the best moves tomorrow, sweetie." She kneeled down, cupping Emily's cherubic face. "But tonight, Mommy has to go somewhere important." Emily's eyes widened with curiosity. "Where?" Sarah hesitated. How could she explain the gilded world of Ethan Pierce and the strange invitation that had been thrust at her like a challenge? "Just work," she finally said, her voice steady. Emily's gaze shifted, her mouth forming a small, uncertain line. "Will you be okay, Mommy?" The question lodged itself in Sarah's heart. She hugged her daughter, inhaling the scent of strawberry shampoo. "Of course I will," she whispered, "because I have you." But as she stood, the weight of her promise felt like a burden. She didn't know how or why she had become a focus of Ethan Pierce's twisted games. All she knew was that she had to go, not because she wanted to, but because defiance could mean losing everything she had fought so hard to keep: her job, her stability, and the fragile peace she had carved out for herself and Emily. Ethan was surrounded by a circle of impeccably dressed guests, laughter echoing in the grand ballroom he had reserved. The crystal chandeliers cast kaleidoscopic reflections over the guests, champagne flutes clinked, and the air was thick with the scent of wealth and privilege. His gaze, however, was laser-focused on the entrance. She had to come. She would come. And then she did. Sarah stepped in, hesitant but composed, wearing a simple, borrowed dress that made her look out of place among the glittering gowns and custom suits. Ethan's lips curled into a smug smile, yet he couldn't ignore the unexpected tightening in his chest. Beside her, holding her hand tightly, was Emily, the little girl with large, innocent eyes that drank in the spectacle around her. Emily's gaze soon drifted upward, captivated by the music echoing through the room. Then, in the middle of that shimmering space, she began to hum softly. It was barely audible at first, but the melody made Ethan freeze. His heart lurched violently. It was a lullaby, one he had not heard in decades. He dropped his champagne glass. The shattering sound drew the room's attention, but Ethan didn't care. He was lost, transported back to a past he had tried so hard to forget. A past that now echoed painfully through the voice of an innocent child. Ethan stood motionless, the pieces of shattered glass scattered at his feet, forgotten. His pulse pounded in his ears as he watched the little girl, Emily, humming that haunting lullaby. It was the same melody his sister Lila used to sing when they were children, a tune that had comforted him on sleepless nights and dark, stormy afternoons. Yet here it was, floating back to him across the vast room, like an old ghost dragging up memories he had long since buried. Sarah noticed the broken glass first, her gaze shifting quickly to Ethan, then back to Emily. Her daughter's humming filled the silence, and she squeezed Emily's hand, as if to anchor herself in the present. She couldn't quite understand the shock in Ethan's eyes, the way his confident, hardened demeanor seemed to crack. But in that moment, he looked like a man staring into an abyss. Emily, still lost in her own world, tugged gently on Sarah's hand. "Mommy," she whispered, "can I sing the whole song? It sounds pretty here." Before Sarah could answer, Ethan took a step forward, his expression darkening. The weight of his gaze was almost unbearable, and Sarah's breath caught. Instinctively, she took a small step back, holding Emily closer. She had seen the look in Ethan's eyes before, a cold, calculated glint he wore when he was on the verge of delivering an icy command. But this was different. This was raw, vulnerable, and it unsettled her deeply. Without breaking eye contact, Ethan called over his shoulder to one of the waitstaff. "Clean this up," he muttered, his voice strained. Then he turned on his heel and strode purposefully towards the balcony doors, his long coat billowing behind him. Sarah felt her shoulders release slightly as he disappeared from view, but her unease lingered. She needed to leave. She shouldn't have brought Emily here. She bent down to Emily's level, brushing a strand of hair away from her daughter's face. "Let's go home, sweetheart," she whispered, trying to mask the urgency in her voice. But before she could lead Emily out, a man approached, one of Ethan's assistants. "Mr. Pierce would like to speak with you," the man said, his tone polite but insistent. Sarah's heart sank. She had expected this might happen, but she had no choice now. Forcing a calm smile, she glanced down at Emily. "Stay close to Mommy, okay?" Emily nodded, her small fingers clutching Sarah's hand tightly. Together, they followed the assistant through the grand room and out onto the balcony. Ethan stood at the edge, his hands gripping the railing as he gazed out over the New York skyline. The city lights reflected on his face, casting an almost haunted glow over his features. At the sound of their footsteps, he turned, his gaze flickering from Sarah to Emily and back again, as if trying to solve some riddle only he could see. Ethan's voice was soft, yet intense. "Where did she learn that song?" Sarah stiffened, taken aback by the suddenness of the question. "Emily sings it sometimes. Just a lullaby, really," she replied cautiously. "Why?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Just a lullaby?" He took a step closer, his tone laced with something she couldn't quite place. Hurt, perhaps, or confusion. "That song," he began, then stopped himself, as though the words were too heavy to continue. "My sister used to sing it," he finally managed. "When we were children." Sarah's breath caught. She studied Ethan's face, searching for some sign of a joke, but his expression was deadly serious. A pang of sympathy flickered within her, despite everything. The powerful, impassive man she'd seen from afar was nowhere to be found. In his place was a person staring into the abyss of his own past. "I didn't know," Sarah murmured, glancing down at Emily, who watched Ethan with wide, curious eyes. I'm sorry. Ethan's gaze softened momentarily as he looked at Emily, his anger melting into something else, something far more unsettling. He seemed almost lost, as if he couldn't quite place himself in the present. That song, he whispered, it's not just a lullaby to me. It's all I have left of her. He let out a shaky breath, running a hand through his hair before looking back at Sarah. Where did you say you were from? Sarah tensed. This wasn't small talk. She could feel that Ethan's questions were carefully constructed, that each answer she gave only deepened his curiosity. We're from the city, she replied vaguely, choosing her words with caution. But we've moved around a lot. Moved around a lot? Ethan echoed, a hint of doubt in his tone. His eyes remained fixed on her, searching for something. And your family? They're here too? Sarah hesitated. No, it's just me and Emily. The intensity of Ethan's stare was unsettling, as if he was trying to peer straight through her, peeling back her defenses. For a brief moment, she thought she saw a flicker of recognition, a suspicion brewing behind his eyes. She braced herself, waiting for the next question, but Ethan's expression suddenly shifted. He looked away, seemingly disturbed by his own thoughts. You may go, he said abruptly, his voice clipped, as though he were cutting off a dangerous line of thinking. Take your daughter and leave. Sarah didn't need to be told twice. She turned, ushering Emily quickly back through the party and out to the waiting car. The chill of the evening air wrapped around them as she lifted Emily into the back seat, buckling her in with trembling hands. Once she closed the door, Sarah took a steadying breath, trying to shake the lingering effects of Ethan's intense scrutiny. She could still feel his gaze, heavy and unyielding, as if he had tried to see into her soul. As she climbed into the driver's seat, Emily's small voice broke the silence. Mommy, why was the man so sad? Sarah's hand paused on the ignition. She glanced at her daughter in the rearview mirror, her heart sinking as she remembered Ethan's face. He just remembered something important, that's all. Was it because of my song? Emily asked, her innocent eyes wide with curiosity. Sarah managed a faint smile, though inside, a new sense of dread was building. Yes, honey, I think it was. In the days that followed the party, Ethan couldn't shake the memory of Emily's song. It replayed in his mind like a half-forgotten dream, surfacing whenever he closed his eyes, echoing in the stillness of his apartment. He paced through the empty rooms of his penthouse, surrounded by art and furniture worth millions. Yet he felt like an outsider in his own home. He was a man haunted, tethered to memories he had spent his entire life avoiding. And somehow, that haunting had a name and a face. Emily, the little girl with the same lullaby that his sister Lila had once sung. At first, Ethan tried to dismiss it as coincidence. New York was full of people from every background. It wasn't impossible that another family knew the song. But as the days passed, that explanation began to feel flimsy. He couldn't ignore the suspicion gnawing at him. That Emily was more than a stranger's daughter, that Sarah and Emily's presence in his life wasn't a random encounter at all. He needed answers, and he had the resources to get them. One morning, Ethan called his most trusted investigator, Gregory Harlan, a former detective with a reputation for finding whatever his clients needed, legal or otherwise. As soon as Gregory picked up, Ethan's voice was sharp, controlled. I need you to look into someone, he said without preamble. Her name is Sarah Donovan. Lives in Queens, works here at the penthouse. She has a daughter, Emily, about 7 years old. Find out everything you can about them. Where they're from, who they're connected to. Everything. There was a pause before Gregory replied. Understood. I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Ethan hung up, feeling a small sense of relief, though it was fleeting. He didn't fully understand why this mattered so much, why he was chasing after threads that might lead to nothing but disappointment. But the lullaby was real. That single, ghostly connection was enough to fuel his determination. Meanwhile, Sarah had tried her best to push the strange encounter with Ethan out of her mind. She knew he was powerful, that his wealth could bury secrets and create problems she couldn't even imagine. But she was also certain that keeping her distance was the only way to protect herself and Emily. One evening after she tucked Emily into bed, Sarah sat at their small kitchen table, bills and budget sheets spread before her. She rubbed her temples, exhausted. Life had never been easy, but the last few days had weighed on her like never before. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Ethan's piercing gaze, the look of raw confusion and pain that had momentarily broken through his cold exterior. Why did that song affect him so much? She thought. What could it possibly mean? Her thoughts were interrupted by a light knock at the door. Sarah froze. They weren't expecting anyone, and it was rare for her neighbors to stop by unannounced. Cautiously, she approached the door, peering through the peephole. A woman stood outside, dressed in a crisp gray suit, holding a small black notebook. Sarah hesitated, but the woman didn't look dangerous, just official. "Miss Donovan?" the woman asked as Sarah opened the door a crack. "Yes?" Sarah replied warily. The woman offered a polite but tight-lipped smile. "My name is Olivia Marks. I work for Mr. Ethan Pierce." Sarah's stomach dropped. She opened the door wider, her mind racing with questions and fears. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice barely concealing the tremor. "Mr. Pierce asked me to deliver this." Olivia held out an envelope with Ethan's initials embossed on the back. "He requests that you read it at your earliest convenience." Sarah took the envelope, her hands trembling. "Thank you," she murmured, though she could feel her heart pounding. Without another word, Olivia nodded and disappeared down the hallway. Sarah closed the door and sat at the table, staring at the envelope as if it might explode. After a moment, she tore it open, pulling out a single sheet of fine, thick paper. Ethan's handwriting was precise and elegant, his message brief but unnerving. "Sarah, there are questions I need answered. Things that don't add up. I believe you owe me a conversation. Tomorrow, 10 o'clock. I'll expect you in my office. Ethan Pierce." Sarah read the note twice, then once more, as if the words might change into something benign. But the message was clear, and she could feel her pulse quickening as dread pooled in her stomach. She couldn't refuse. Ethan Pierce was not a man who took no for an answer. The next morning, Sarah dressed carefully, choosing her most conservative outfit, a simple blouse and a pair of dark slacks that she hoped would make her look professional, unassuming. After dropping Emily off at school, she headed to Ethan's office, feeling a strange sense of foreboding with every step. As she approached the towering office building where Pierce Industries held its headquarters, she felt a rush of anxiety. She didn't belong here, among the sleek glass walls and the polished professionals who moved with purpose and confidence. After checking in with the receptionist, she was led to the top floor, where Ethan's private office occupied an entire wing. The elevator doors opened to reveal a sprawling, minimalist space with floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the city skyline. Ethan was standing by his desk, hands clasped behind his back, as if waiting for her. He turned as she entered, his expression unreadable. "Sarah," he said evenly, gesturing for her to sit. She did so, folding her hands in her lap, trying to maintain her composure. Ethan took a seat across from her, leaning forward slightly. His eyes were sharp, focused entirely on her, and she felt as if every inch of her was being scrutinized. After a moment, he spoke. "Sarah," he began, his voice low but firm, "I'll get straight to the point. That song, the one your daughter sang at the party, it's not just any song. It's personal." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "I need to know where she learned it. Who taught her?" Sarah felt herself tense, unsure of how to answer. She couldn't tell him the truth, couldn't explain the complex and tangled reasons behind why Emily knew that song. But Ethan's eyes bored into her, unyielding, and she knew he wouldn't let her leave without some kind of answer. "I don't know," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "Emily, she just knows it. She sings it to herself sometimes, but I never taught it to her." Ethan's jaw clenched. He seemed unsatisfied, as if he knew she was holding something back. "Is that so?" he asked, his tone skeptical. "A child doesn't just know something like that. There's more to this, Sarah, and I'm not leaving it alone until I understand why." The intensity in his voice sent a chill down her spine. She fought to keep her composure, reminding herself that Ethan was just a man, no matter how powerful. "I understand that this song means something to you," she said carefully. "But my daughter, she's just a child. We don't owe you answers to things that don't involve us." Ethan's gaze softened for the briefest moment before hardening again. "Maybe it doesn't involve you, Sarah," he replied coldly, "but it involves her. And I need to understand if this is a coincidence, or if it's something else." The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. Sarah felt her pulse quicken, her palms sweating. She wanted to leave, to protect Emily from whatever dark secrets haunted Ethan's life. But as she rose to her feet, he spoke once more, his voice carrying a weight that felt almost like a warning. "This isn't over, Sarah. I'll get to the truth, one way or another." Without another word, she turned and left his office, her mind racing with questions and fears. She couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan's suspicions were the beginning of something far more dangerous than she could have anticipated. Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white as she navigated the dense New York traffic. Ethan's words echoed in her mind, each syllable laced with a threat she couldn't ignore. This isn't over. She had hoped that leaving his office would mean leaving his questions, but she knew deep down that she had only bought herself time. The moment she parked in front of Emily's school, her anxiety melted away as she spotted her daughter waiting on the steps, clutching her backpack, her face lighting up when she saw Sarah. Emily ran to the car, climbed into the back seat, and immediately started chattering about her day, blissfully unaware of the tension that had Sarah on edge. As they drove home, Emily hummed softly, that same haunting lullaby that had triggered Ethan's suspicions. Sarah's heart clenched as she listened, her hands tightening on the wheel. How could she explain to a child the weight that song carried, the memories and dangers it had dredged up? How could she protect Emily from something she herself barely understood? When they arrived home, Sarah quickly busied herself with preparing dinner, the familiar routine grounding her, if only for a moment. But her mind kept drifting back to Ethan's cold gaze, the intensity with which he had demanded answers she couldn't give. She glanced over at Emily, who was setting the table with all the care and concentration of a child who had made it her personal duty. "Mommy," Emily said, looking up from her task, "are we going to Mr. Pierce's party again?" The question hit Sarah like a punch to the chest. "No, honey," she said quickly. "We're not going back there." Emily seemed disappointed, but she nodded, her expression shifting to curiosity. "Why not?" Sarah hesitated, not wanting to lie, but feeling the need to protect her daughter. "It's just we don't belong there," she replied gently. "That's his world, and ours is here. Okay?" Emily seemed to ponder this for a moment before shrugging and moving on, satisfied with the answer for now. But as Sarah watched her, a strange fear crept in. What if Ethan's world wasn't something they could simply walk away from? What if, somehow, he pulled them back in? That night, after Emily had gone to bed, Sarah sat alone in the dimly lit living room, the silence pressing in on her. She felt trapped, as though Ethan's suspicions had spun a web around her and Emily, a web she couldn't escape without risking everything. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft buzz from her phone on the coffee table. She picked it up, her heart skipping a beat when she saw an unknown number flashing on the screen. With a deep breath, she answered, bracing herself for what might come. "Sarah Donovan?" The voice was unfamiliar, male, with a no-nonsense tone. "Yes. Who's this?" "This is Gregory Harlan," the man replied smoothly. "I work for Mr. Pierce. He's asked me to look into a few things regarding your background, as well as your daughter's." There was a pause, and Sarah could almost hear the smirk in his voice. "But I thought it would be better to talk to you directly before I proceed." Sarah's blood ran cold. I don't understand. What do you want?" "Just some clarification," Harlan replied, sounding entirely too casual. "You see, Mr. Pierce is a man who values accuracy, and he's interested in understanding how your daughter knows a song that holds personal significance for him." Sarah's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Emily is just a child," she replied evenly. "She doesn't know anything about Ethan's past." Harlan chuckled softly, an unsettling sound that sent a chill down her spine. I think we both know there's more to this than that, Miss Donovan. I'd hate to have to dig through official records, talk to old acquaintances, look up. Stop, Sarah interrupted, her voice shaky but determined. She couldn't let this stranger, this hired detective, pry into her past and unearth secrets she had fought hard to bury. What exactly does Ethan want from us? What he wants, Harlan replied, his tone darkening, is the truth. The line went silent, and Sarah sat frozen, her mind racing. She had hoped that distancing herself from Ethan would protect Emily, but now it was clear that he would stop at nothing to get answers. She needed to find a way to shield her daughter, to keep Ethan's reach from pulling them into the depths of whatever haunted him. The following day, Sarah made a decision. She couldn't simply wait for Ethan to come to her, couldn't risk him sending Harlan or anyone else to dig deeper into her past. She needed to face him, to find a way to make him understand that whatever he was looking for didn't involve them. That afternoon, after picking up Emily from school, Sarah took her to a friend's house, asking her to watch Emily for a few hours. It's something important, she told her friend, who nodded without question, sensing Sarah's urgency. With Emily safe, Sarah made her way to Pierce Industries once again. The receptionist seemed surprised to see her, but within minutes, Sarah was escorted up to Ethan's office. This time, she didn't wait for an invitation. She pushed the doors open and stepped inside, finding him seated at his desk, surrounded by papers and files. His head lifted, a faint flicker of surprise in his eyes before his usual steely gaze returned. "Sarah," he greeted, his voice neutral, yet edged with curiosity. "This is unexpected." She crossed the room, standing before his desk. "I need you to leave Emily alone," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "She's just a little girl. Whatever answers you're looking for, they're not with her." Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying her, his gaze unwavering. "And yet she knows something that only a very select few would know," he replied, his tone calm but relentless. "You may not want to admit it, but that song, it's connected to me, to my past. I don't believe in coincidences, Sarah. There are things you don't understand," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. "But digging into Emily's life, into my life, isn't going to help you find closure." Ethan's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. "And what exactly am I supposed to believe, Sarah? That a little girl randomly knows a song only my sister used to sing to me? A song that's been a secret in my family for years?" Sarah swallowed, trying to keep her composure. "I don't know how she knows it, Ethan, but please, for her sake, let this go." For a moment, Ethan's gaze softened, a hint of something almost like sympathy flickering in his eyes. But just as quickly, his expression returned to its cold, guarded mask. "If you want me to let this go, Sarah," he said quietly, "then tell me the truth. Why is Emily here? Why did you come to New York?" Sarah hesitated, feeling the weight of his words pressing down on her. She knew that revealing the full truth would be a risk, one that could change both of their lives forever. But Ethan's relentless determination made it clear that he wouldn't stop until he got the answers he was after. "Emily and I came here to start over," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "We were looking for a fresh start, somewhere we could be safe. But that's all there is to it, Ethan. Nothing more." Ethan studied her, his gaze penetrating, as though he was trying to unravel every layer of her story. "If that's true," he said slowly, "then why do I feel like you're hiding something from me?" Sarah shook her head, the weight of his suspicion pressing down on her. "I don't know what you want me to say. Emily and I we're just trying to live our lives." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the air thick with tension. Finally, Ethan let out a sigh, leaning back in his chair. "Very well, Sarah," he said, his tone resigned but firm. "But know this. If there's more to this than you're telling me, I will find out. And I won't be forgiving." Sarah met his gaze, feeling a surge of defiance rise within her. "Do what you have to, Ethan, but I won't let you hurt my daughter. I'll do whatever it takes to keep her safe." Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked out of his office, her heart pounding. She had stood up to him, but she knew this wasn't over. She could feel it in her bones. Ethan Pierce was a man who wouldn't rest until he had uncovered every last secret, no matter the cost. And now, for better or worse, they were bound by a truth that neither of them was ready to face. The days that followed Sarah's confrontation with Ethan were filled with an oppressive tension. She felt as if she were constantly looking over her shoulder, waiting for the next shoe to drop. Every time her phone rang, her heart skipped a beat, dreading that it might be Ethan or someone from his team with more questions. She tried to reassure herself that she had told him everything she could, that there was nothing more he could pull from her. But Ethan was not a man easily deterred, and she knew that well. Meanwhile, Ethan's days were equally consumed with the mystery of Sarah and Emily. His determination, once cold and calculated, had turned personal. He couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah was hiding something, and he was convinced it had to do with his sister's disappearance. The song, the timing, the way Sarah had looked at him in his office. All of it felt like pieces to a puzzle he was desperate to solve. One evening, unable to quiet the questions raging in his mind, Ethan sat alone in his study, his fingers drumming on the polished wood of his desk. His thoughts were dark, turbulent, pulling him back to his childhood, to memories of Lila's laughter, her gentle voice as she sang that lullaby to him, her little brother who was afraid of the dark. The thought of her, the sister he had loved and lost, made his chest tighten painfully. He couldn't let this go, not until he knew for sure what connection, if any, existed between Sarah's daughter and his sister's memory. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to see Gregory Harlan standing in the doorway, an envelope in his hand. "Sir," Gregory said, his tone grave, "I have the information you requested on Sarah Donovan." Ethan straightened, gesturing for him to enter. He watched intently as Gregory placed the envelope on the desk, then opened it, revealing a small stack of papers. "I trust it's thorough?" Ethan asked. Gregory nodded, his expression carefully neutral. "Yes, sir. I followed every lead, and there were some interesting findings." Ethan's jaw clenched, and he picked up the first page, scanning it quickly. Sarah Donovan, originally from a small town in the Midwest, had moved to New York a few years back with her daughter. She had worked various jobs, mostly cleaning or waitressing, anything to make ends meet. There was no mention of Emily's father, no family ties in the city, no reason that explained why she had come to New York at all. The deeper Ethan read, the more he began to feel an unsettling familiarity. Gregory's report outlined details that, on the surface, seemed innocuous. But as he flipped through the pages, he spotted something that made him freeze. A birth certificate for Emily Donovan. His eyes zeroed in on the names listed, noting that the field for the father's name was left blank. But it was the name of the mother that caught his attention. Sarah Lila Donovan. Lila, his sister's name. The room spun for a moment as he processed the information. Could this be a coincidence? His rational mind told him yes, Lila wasn't an uncommon name. But he couldn't shake the idea that this was a clue, a piece of something much larger. He glanced up at Gregory, who was watching him carefully. "Is there anything else?" Gregory hesitated, then nodded. "There's one more thing, sir. I tracked down some records from the small town where Sarah is originally from. It turns out her mother passed away when she was young, and she was placed in foster care soon after. No known siblings, no close relatives. She's been alone most of her life." Ethan's mind raced as he tried to make sense of it all. Sarah had grown up without family, moving from place to place, trying to build a life for herself and her daughter. But there was something in this story that felt like an echo of his own past, a ghostly resemblance to the life he and Lila had known before she disappeared. He cleared his throat, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "Thank you, Gregory. That will be all for now." As Gregory left, Ethan sat back in his chair, staring at the birth certificate in his hand. He couldn't help but wonder, could Sarah and Emily somehow be connected to Lila? Had Lila, his own sister, lived a life he knew nothing about? His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden memory, one he hadn't revisited in years. A memory of a young Lila, holding his hand tightly, her eyes wide with fear as she whispered to him about running away, about finding a life of her own away from their troubled family. She had always been the brave one, the one who dreamed of escaping. Had she done it? Had she left and found a way to start over, with Sarah as her legacy? The questions swirled in his mind, and he knew there was only one way to find answers. He needed to confront Sarah again. The next morning, as Sarah was helping Emily with breakfast, her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. She glanced at it, her heart sinking as she saw Ethan's name flashing on the screen. She took a deep breath and answered, her voice as steady as she could manage. "Sarah." Ethan's voice was calm, almost too calm. "We need to talk. Today. I'll be at your apartment in an hour." She felt a chill run through her. "Mr. Pierce, that's not necessary." "I'm afraid it is," he replied, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "I have some questions that need answering. I suggest you prepare yourself." Before she could respond, he hung up, leaving her staring at the phone, her pulse racing. She looked over at Emily, who was happily munching on her cereal, oblivious to the tension that had just filled the room. Sarah knew she couldn't keep running from this. Ethan had pieced something together, and now he was coming to her home, to the one place she had tried to keep him away from. She needed to find a way to protect Emily from whatever revelations were about to unfold. When Ethan arrived at the modest apartment building in Queens, he barely noticed the worn paint or the cracked tiles in the hallway. His focus was singular as he climbed the stairs to Sarah's door. He knocked, and within seconds, the door opened. Sarah stood there, looking tense, but resolved. "Come in," she said quietly, stepping aside as he entered. Her apartment was small and tidy, with drawings from Emily taped to the walls and a faint scent of lavender lingering in the air. The simplicity of it struck him, reminding him of his own childhood home. He turned to face Sarah, his expression unreadable. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," he said, though his tone was icy. Sarah crossed her arms, bracing herself. "You didn't exactly give me a choice." Ethan ignored her remark, his gaze intense as he continued. "I looked into your background, Sarah," he said bluntly, "and I found some interesting details. Your middle name, for instance." Sarah's eyes widened slightly, a hint of fear flashing across her face. "Why does that matter?" "Because it's the same name as my sister's," Ethan replied, his voice low. "Lila was my sister's name. And that song, it was her song." "How do you explain that, Sarah?" She shook her head, a look of desperation in her eyes. "Ethan, please. You're making connections where there aren't any." "Am I?" he asked, his tone cutting. "Or is there something you're not telling me?" Sarah closed her eyes briefly, then opened them, meeting his gaze with a mixture of defiance and sorrow. "My mother. She was the one who taught Emily that song. It was something she sang to me when I was a child. I didn't realize it would mean anything to anyone else." The words hung in the air, and Ethan felt a strange, unsettling sense of recognition. He took a step closer, his voice softening despite himself. "And your mother? What was her name?" Sarah hesitated, her voice barely a whisper. "Her name was Lily, but she went by Lila sometimes." The silence was deafening as Ethan absorbed her words, his mind spinning. Lily, Lila. Had she somehow lived a life he had never known? A life that had extended beyond him, beyond the world they'd grown up in? His chest tightened, and for the first time in years, he felt the sting of tears threatening to surface. If what you're saying is true," he murmured, struggling to keep his voice steady, "then that would mean—" Sarah nodded, her own eyes shining with a mixture of fear and sadness. "It would mean Emily is her granddaughter. Your sister's granddaughter." The revelation hung between them like a fragile thread, connecting them in a way neither had anticipated. Ethan stood frozen, the weight of Sarah's words pressing down on him like a physical blow. The world around him seemed to blur, narrowing down to just the two of them in that small apartment. His sister, Lila, gone for so many years, lost to the cruelty of the world they had both fought to escape. And now, here was her legacy, a granddaughter, a child who had unknowingly carried a part of Lila into the present, bridging a gap Ethan had thought could never be crossed. He sank onto the nearest chair, his hand running over his face as he struggled to process what he just heard. Sarah stood quietly nearby, her expression cautious but sympathetic, watching him with an empathy that he neither wanted nor could bring himself to reject. So, Ethan's voice was hoarse as he looked up at her. Lila, she survived. She made a life. He looked away, as if unable to meet Sarah's gaze, his mind caught in a storm of memories. He could see Lila as she had been, the fearless older sister, the one who had shielded him, encouraged him, even when life had tried to crush their spirits. The thought that she had managed to escape their broken world, to have a child, was something he had never allowed himself to hope for. Sarah nodded slowly. Yes, she did, she murmured. My mother. She always told me stories about where she came from, about what she left behind. She never told me everything, but I always sensed there was a lot she wanted to protect me from. Ethan's eyes darkened as he listened, the flicker of hope quickly fading as the reality of the years he had missed settled in. Why did she leave? He asked, his voice laced with an ache that surprised even him. Why didn't she tell me where she was? Sarah sighed, a trace of sadness in her gaze. I think she was afraid, Ethan. She was afraid of the life she left behind, and what might happen if she came back. A bitter laugh escaped him, filled with a resentment he couldn't entirely suppress. Afraid of me, he muttered, almost to himself. Afraid of the family she abandoned? Sarah's eyes softened. Afraid of the pain, I think. Afraid of having to face the past. She always said that moving forward was her only way to survive. And when I was young, I didn't understand that. But now, I think I do. Ethan studied her, feeling a strange pang of kinship, an uncomfortable recognition of the determination and resilience that had clearly shaped Sarah's life. He understood that drive, that instinct to protect what little piece she had carved out, because he'd been doing the same thing for years. Only, where he had built a fortress of wealth and power, she had built a life for her daughter, trying to give Emily a chance to grow up free of the shadows that had haunted her own childhood. He glanced at the closed door of Emily's bedroom, and a sudden, overpowering urge filled him. The need to know her, to be a part of her life. She was his sister's granddaughter, his last link to Lila. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something delicate, a life that had thrived without him. And for once, he was unsure of his place. Does she know? He asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily, does she know anything about Lila? Sarah shook her head, her expression firm but compassionate. No, Emily doesn't know about my mother's past, and she definitely doesn't know about you. I wanted to protect her from the kind of life that my mother tried so hard to leave behind. Ethan felt a pang of guilt, mixed with frustration. You think I'm dangerous, he said flatly, his voice carrying a bitter edge. Sarah hesitated, choosing her words carefully. I don't think you're dangerous, Ethan, but I think you don't fully understand what it means to let go of the past. My mother had her reasons, and I've always respected them. She built a life around making sure I'd never have to look back. That's what I'm trying to do for Emily. He looked away, his jaw clenched. He had always believed he was protecting himself by burying his emotions, by building a life that was impervious to anyone's influence. Yet here he was, confronted by a family he never knew existed, a family that had been hidden from him to preserve the very stability he had craved all these years. I don't know how to do that, he said finally, the words escaping him before he could stop them. Letting go. I don't know what it means to move forward. My whole life, I've just been looking back. The admission hung heavily in the air. Sarah met his gaze, her expression softening. Maybe it's not too late, she said quietly. Maybe now, you can finally move forward. Not just for yourself, but for Emily. He nodded slowly, absorbing the truth of her words. He had a choice, an opportunity to finally let go of the anger and resentment that had been his armor for so long. He could protect Emily, not by hiding her past from her, but by giving her the family she didn't even know she had. And in that moment, a determination took hold of him, a new resolve to protect her in a way he hadn't been able to protect Lila. Can I meet her? He asked, his voice steady but cautious. I know it's a lot to ask, but I'd like to get to know her, even if it's just a little. Sarah hesitated, the conflict evident in her expression. She glanced towards Emily's room, her gaze softening. She's young, Ethan. I don't want her to be confused or overwhelmed. But maybe, if you take things slow, if you're willing to be patient, we could find a way. The relief that surged through him was tempered by the weight of her words. Patience was not a virtue he was used to practicing, but for Emily, he knew he would try. This was Lila's granddaughter, his niece. A chance at family he had thought lost forever. "Thank you," he said quietly, and this time, there was no trace of bitterness or resentment, only gratitude. Sarah offered a small smile, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Just go easy on her, okay? She's only 7. She's curious and bright, but I don't want her to be hurt by things she can't understand yet." Ethan nodded. "I understand. I'll take it slow." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history binding them in a way neither could have anticipated. For Ethan, the silence was filled with thoughts of Lila, of the life she had lived, hidden and distant, yet still connected to him through her daughter and granddaughter. For Sarah, it was a quiet moment of acceptance, a reluctant realization that her past could not be entirely severed from her present. Just then, a soft creak from the hallway broke the silence. They both turned to see Emily standing there, her small figure illuminated by the hallway light, her eyes wide as she looked from Sarah to Ethan. "Mommy?" she asked, her voice soft. Is he a friend?" Sarah and Ethan exchanged a look, and then Sarah smiled, her voice gentle. "Yes, sweetheart. This is Mr. Pierce. He's a friend of ours." Emily studied Ethan with a mixture of curiosity and shyness. Ethan felt his heart twist, seeing Lila's features reflected in the little girl's eyes, her expression one of quiet wonder. "Hi, Mr. Pierce," Emily said softly, a shy smile appearing on her face. Ethan swallowed hard, his voice thick with emotion as he replied, "Hi, Emily." He had never been so grateful for a simple greeting, for the chance to speak to her without the burden of secrets and lies. And as he watched her smile back at him, he realized that this small, fragile connection was more valuable than anything he had ever built or earned in his life. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something he hadn't dared to hope for, a glimmer of peace. Ethan left Sarah's apartment that evening with a feeling he could barely name, a mix of longing and a sense of responsibility that had settled heavily on his shoulders. He had known power, wealth, influence, and yet, as he walked out into the cool night air, he felt like he was finally stepping into a life that held real meaning. Emily, his sister's granddaughter, was a piece of Lila brought back to him, a part of his own heart he thought he'd lost forever. Over the next few weeks, Ethan made an effort to be present in Emily's life, careful not to intrude or overwhelm. He kept his approach gentle, observing her from a respectful distance, slowly building trust. He visited Sarah and Emily at their apartment, bringing small gifts for Emily, a book, a set of crayons, a music box. Sarah watched each gesture warily at first, but Ethan sensed that her hesitation was slowly softening. Her trust was something he knew he'd have to earn, and he was willing to wait. One Saturday afternoon, Ethan invited Sarah and Emily to a small park just outside the city. It was a modest place, tucked away from the bustling streets, with sprawling trees and winding paths. When they arrived, Emily immediately broke into a run, her laughter bright and clear as she darted towards the playground. Ethan watched her with a smile, marveling at the simplicity of her joy. He could feel Lila's spirit in that laughter, in the carefree way Emily moved, and it made his heart ache with gratitude. As Emily climbed the jungle gym, Sarah and Ethan sat on a bench nearby, watching her with quiet smiles. The early autumn air was crisp, and the trees had begun to turn shades of amber and red, casting a warm glow over the park. For the first time in years, Ethan felt a sense of calm. "Thank you for letting me be a part of this," he said softly, glancing at Sarah. It's more than I ever thought I'd have." Sarah nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It hasn't been easy," she admitted. "I've been so used to protecting Emily, keeping her world small and safe. Letting someone in, especially someone from my mother's past. It's taken some getting used to." Ethan understood. "I won't push," he promised. "I just want to be here for her, however you think is best." Sarah looked at him, her gaze softening. "You're not who I thought you were, Ethan. I mean, you're not the man I expected you to be." Ethan chuckled, a rueful smile crossing his face. "I didn't expect to be this man either," he said quietly. "But Emily has changed that." As they sat together in silence, a sudden shout from Emily caught their attention. She had climbed to the top of the jungle gym, her face alight with pride as she called down to them. "Look, Mommy! Look, Mr. Pierce!" Ethan's heart swelled as he looked up at her, waving back. "I see you, Emily. You're a natural up there." Emily grinned, basking in his praise. And in that moment, something small but significant shifted. Ethan felt a warmth, a tenderness, that he hadn't felt since he was a child himself. This was family, a bond he had thought he'd never have again. But as they left the park that day, reality soon returned, a reminder that this fragile connection was far from secure. Ethan's family, his world, was not a simple one. His business, his wealth, his name. These things had enemies, hidden dangers that he knew could one day cast a shadow over Sarah and Emily. He knew, deep down, that as much as he wanted to be a part of their lives, his presence might also bring risks he couldn't control. That night, as he sat alone in his penthouse, staring out at the city skyline, his mind raced with questions and fears. How could he protect them without pushing them away? How could he build a life with them when his own life was filled with secrets and threats? The path he had chosen was not without its dangers, and now, with Sarah and Emily in his life, he felt the weight of responsibility in a way he never had before. Over the next few weeks, Ethan's connection with Emily grew, their bond forming in ways that surprised him. She would call him sometimes after school, her small voice bubbling with excitement as she recounted her day. He found himself waiting for those calls, smiling to himself as he listened to her innocent stories. It was a simple joy, a connection that gave him something to look forward to in a life that had often felt hollow. One evening, Sarah called him unexpectedly. "Ethan," she began, her voice hesitant. "Emily, she's been asking more questions about her grandmother." "About my mother?" Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He had known this moment would come, but he hadn't expected it so soon. "What have you told her?" Sarah sighed. "I told her a little bit. About my mom, and how she was strong and brave. But Emily's a smart girl. She's curious. I think she wants to know more." Ethan hesitated, feeling the weight of the past pressing down on him. "Sarah, if you're open to it, I'd like to help tell her that story. To let her know about the family she never knew." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice soft. "I think that would mean a lot to her. And to me." They planned a small, quiet gathering in Sarah's apartment one evening. Sarah prepared a simple meal, and they set a few old family photos on the coffee table, photos Ethan had kept tucked away for years, unable to look at them without feeling the ache of loss. Now, as he carefully placed them on the table, he felt a sense of closure, a readiness to share the memories he had kept guarded for so long. When Emily joined them, she gazed at the photos with wide eyes, her little hands reaching out to touch the edges of each picture. Ethan pointed to one of the photos, a faded snapshot of himself and Lila as children, standing beside a tree with bright smiles. Lila's arm was wrapped protectively around him, her face lit up with a joy that still radiated through the years. "Is that Grandma?" Emily asked, her voice filled with wonder. Ethan nodded, his heart tightening. "Yes, that's her. And that's me, when I was just a little older than you are now." Emily's eyes sparkled as she studied the photo, her tiny fingers tracing the lines of her grandmother's face. "She looks kind," she said softly. "She was," Ethan replied, his voice thick with emotion. "She was the kindest person I ever knew. And brave. She was very brave." Emily looked up at him, a question in her eyes. "Did she love you a lot, Mr. Pierce?" He nodded, unable to find his voice for a moment. "Yes," he whispered. "She loved me more than anything." They spent the evening talking about Lila, sharing memories that painted a picture of the woman she had been, a woman whose strength and spirit lived on through Emily. Ethan told her stories of Lila's laughter, her resilience, how she had always dreamed of a better life, a life filled with love and family. Emily listened intently, her eyes wide as she absorbed every word, her small hand clutching Ethan's as though grounding herself in these newfound connections. When the evening came to a close and it was time for Emily to go to bed, she hugged Ethan tightly, a gesture that left him momentarily speechless. "Thank you for telling me about Grandma," she murmured, her voice sleepy but full of gratitude. "I feel like I know her now." Ethan hugged her back, feeling a deep sense of peace. "She would have been so proud of you, Emily. You're everything she dreamed of." As Emily went to bed, Ethan and Sarah shared a quiet moment, both feeling the weight of what they had shared. For Ethan, it was as if a piece of his heart had finally been mended. A wound he had carried for so long now softened by the love he had found in his niece. Before he left that night, Ethan turned to Sarah, his voice steady but filled with a new determination. "I'll protect her, Sarah. Whatever it takes, I'll make sure she's safe." Sarah nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I know you will, Ethan, and thank you for everything." As he walked back out into the night, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. A hope that he could build a new family, that he could honor Lila's memory by being there for Emily in a way he hadn't been able to for his sister. And for the first time, the road ahead felt like a journey worth taking, one filled with purpose and, perhaps, even happiness. As the weeks turned into months, Ethan's presence became a stable, quiet comfort in Sarah and Emily's lives. He continued visiting them on weekends, taking Emily to parks, museums, and small adventures around the city. They shared quiet dinners, laughter, and moments that allowed Ethan glimpses of a life he had never thought possible. With each visit, he grew more at ease, feeling less like an outsider and more like a part of their little family. But the closeness also came with a new, gnawing fear: the fragility of what he'd found. His empire was massive, powerful, but it wasn't invincible. He knew too well the kind of people his money and influence could attract: the jealous, the dangerous, the ones who wouldn't hesitate to use his newfound family as leverage against him. The thought of Emily or Sarah being pulled into his world of power plays and ruthless business deals terrified him. One cold evening, as they shared a quiet meal, Ethan's thoughts lingered on this fear. After a long pause, he set down his fork, looking at Sarah with an intensity that made her pause. "I want to protect you both," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "And for that, there are things you both need to know about my life. Things I haven't told you yet." Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly, her expression a mix of caution and curiosity. "What do you mean, Ethan?" he sighed, glancing at Emily, who was busy with her plate, blissfully unaware. "My business, it's not as straightforward as it seems. The power, the influence, I didn't get them without making enemies, people who would do anything to bring me down." Sarah looked at him with quiet understanding, sensing the weight behind his words. "We knew you had a complicated life, Ethan," she replied. "But what are you saying? Do you think we're in danger?" Ethan struggled to put his fears into words, not wanting to frighten her, but feeling she needed to know. "I'm saying that as long as I'm around, there's a risk. I can protect you, and I will. But if my enemies knew what you meant to me, if they knew about Emily," he trailed off, his voice thick with worry. Sarah's face softened, and she reached across the table, her hand covering his. "Ethan, we trust you, but we've built a life of peace, a life that's simple. I don't want Emily to lose that innocence because of who you are. But I also know you're part of her life now, and I can't take that from her." They sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Ethan nodded. "Then I'll make sure no harm ever comes to you," he said, his voice resolute. "I'll be careful. I'll keep this part of my life as far from you both as possible." The conversation lingered in his mind for days afterward, shaping his every decision. He became more vigilant, employing a trusted team to discreetly monitor Sarah and Emily's safety without their knowledge. He kept a careful distance, never letting his connection with them become public, guarding their existence like a hidden treasure. But despite his efforts, Ethan couldn't ignore the sense that his life was changing in ways he couldn't fully control. He realized that this love, this family, made him vulnerable in ways he had never anticipated. He could no longer move through life with the same reckless determination, because now, Every choice, every risk, bore consequences that extended beyond himself. One night, as he sat alone in his penthouse, looking out over the city lights, he found himself at peace with this new reality. For the first time, he had something to lose, and he would give everything to protect it. One afternoon, as autumn began to deepen, Sarah received a call from Ethan asking if he could take Emily for a short trip outside the city, a surprise he had planned for her. After a moment's hesitation, Sarah agreed. Sensing Ethan's genuine excitement and knowing how much Emily adored her time with him. As long as they returned by evening, Sarah thought, it would be a harmless escape from their usual routines. When Ethan arrived, Emily was ready and waiting, practically bouncing with anticipation. She hugged her mother, then rushed to Ethan's side, her small hand slipping into his as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Ethan's eyes met Sarah's, and she saw a flicker of something in his expression. Gratitude, perhaps, or maybe something deeper, a silent promise. He nodded, giving her a reassuring smile before he and Emily made their way to the sleek black car waiting by the curb. As they drove, Ethan kept the destination a surprise, despite Emily's endless questions and guesses. They wound through the city, eventually breaking free of its dense buildings and busy streets, heading toward the open roads beyond. Soon, they arrived at a quiet, sprawling property just outside of the city, a stable surrounded by trees shedding their golden autumn leaves. Emily's eyes went wide as she stepped out of the car, gazing around in awe. "Horses!" she exclaimed, pointing to the beautiful animals grazing nearby. Ethan grinned, pleased by her excitement. "That's right," he said, kneeling beside her. "I thought you might like to meet them, and if you're brave enough, we might even take one for a ride." Emily nodded enthusiastically, her eyes shining with delight. They spent the next hour wandering around the stable, meeting each horse one by one. Ethan was patient, guiding her gently, his usual guarded demeanor softened in her presence. Emily had a natural connection with the animals, and Ethan couldn't help but marvel at her ease, her joy. She reminded him so much of Lila, who had once dreamed of a life surrounded by animals and nature, far from the chaos they had grown up in. Finally, after Emily had chosen a gentle, chestnut mare named Ruby, Ethan lifted her onto the saddle, carefully adjusting the reins in her small hands. He climbed onto a horse of his own, riding close beside her, watching as she confidently took the reins, laughing as the horse trotted forward. Her laughter filled the air, and Ethan felt a peace he had never thought possible. This was what he wanted for her, a life untouched by the darkness he carried, by the enemies who watched him from the shadows. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the fields, they stopped by a small, quiet pond. Ethan dismounted, helping Emily down and watching as she ran to the water's edge, her reflection rippling beneath her. For a moment, Ethan felt the urge to tell her everything, to explain who he really was, why he had so carefully guarded his life from the world. But he held back, knowing it was a burden she didn't deserve to carry. Emily, sensing his silence, looked up at him. "Mr. Pierce," she asked softly, "are you sad?" Ethan smiled, surprised by her insight. "Maybe a little," he admitted, "but being here with you makes me very happy." Emily's face brightened, and she took his hand, giving it a squeeze. "Then don't be sad, okay? We can always come here. It can be our special place." Ethan nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. "I'd like that, Emily. Very much." They stood by the pond for a while, watching the sun sink lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. For Ethan, it was a moment he wished he could hold onto forever. A quiet, perfect peace, shared with a piece of his sister's legacy. He knew he would do whatever it took to protect her, to give her a life that was filled with these kinds of moments. And in his heart, he silently vowed to keep his world, his enemies, as far from hers as he could manage. By the time they returned to Sarah's apartment, it was well into the evening, and Emily had fallen asleep in the car, her head resting gently against Ethan's shoulder. He carried her up the stairs, her small body warm and weightless in his arms. When Sarah opened the door, she saw them and smiled softly, her eyes filled with gratitude and something that looked like relief. "She had a wonderful time," Ethan whispered, handing Emily over to Sarah's waiting arms. Sarah nodded, looking down at her sleeping daughter before glancing back at him. "Thank you, Ethan. I don't know what this means to her, or to me." Ethan felt an ache in his chest, a longing he could hardly name. "It means more to me than you can imagine," he replied softly. For the first time, his voice betrayed him, carrying the weight of everything he had held back, everything he was fighting to protect. As he turned to leave, Sarah's voice stopped him. "Ethan," she said, her tone gentle, "you don't have to do all this alone. Whatever you're carrying, whatever you're trying to protect us from, I just want you to know we're here." He paused, a surge of gratitude overwhelming him. He wanted to tell her everything, to unburden himself of the secrets, the regrets, the weight of the life he had led. But he knew that would only put them at risk, dragging them into a world they didn't belong in. So he simply nodded, forcing a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Sarah," he murmured. "Maybe someday, I'll be able to tell you." With that, he left, feeling more connected and yet more alone than ever. He had found something precious, something worth protecting, but he knew it was fragile. As he walked back into the night, he felt the shadows lurking, the unseen forces that would threaten to tear this new happiness from him. And yet, he felt something else too. Hope. The hope that, somehow, he could keep them safe, that he could finally have the family he had always dreamed of. It was a hope he held onto tightly, as if it were the only light he had ever known. As the chill of winter settled over New York, Ethan found himself increasingly bound to the life he had built with Sarah and Emily. What had started as quiet visits and guarded conversations had become a true family bond. The three of them had slipped into a routine, an unspoken understanding, each moment shared deepening the connection that had once seemed so fragile and distant. But in the back of his mind, Ethan knew his world was one that rarely allowed for peace. His business was powerful and filled with ruthless rivals, people who knew that family was often the softest target. And one evening, his worst fear came true. It was a cold night when Ethan received a call from his head of security. There had been a breach. Someone had broken into his personal records, leaving a trail that led straight to Sarah and Emily. He'd known this day could come, but the shock still hit him hard, twisting his insides with dread. He immediately arranged for them to be brought to his penthouse, a place he knew he could protect them, at least until the threat passed. When they arrived, Sarah's face was pale, her expression unreadable as she clutched Emily's hand tightly. Ethan met them in the entryway, his jaw set, his demeanor steeled. He took Sarah's hand in his, a gesture that felt both protective and pleading. "I'm so sorry," he murmured, his voice barely steady. "I didn't want this. I tried to keep you safe." Sarah looked up at him, her gaze steady despite the fear he saw in her eyes. "We knew, Ethan. I've known from the start that your life is complicated. But we're here now, and we'll face this together." Ethan felt a mixture of relief and guilt, knowing he'd brought his past into their present despite every attempt to avoid it. He had built his empire on strength and control, yet here he was, relying on someone else's trust, someone else's courage, to hold it all together. He led them through the penthouse, showing Sarah where she and Emily could rest, making sure they understood the security measures that had been set in place. He had never felt so exposed, so helpless. But as he watched Sarah tuck Emily into bed, humming that familiar lullaby, he felt a surge of determination. He would do whatever it took to keep them safe. Later that night, as Sarah joined him in the living room, she sat beside him on the couch, the city lights casting a faint glow over them. They sat in silence for a long moment, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice soft but unwavering. "Ethan, I think it's time you told me everything. I need to understand what we're up against." He nodded, taking a deep breath. He told her about his business, the years he had spent clawing his way to the top, the enemies he'd made along the way. He told her about the alliances, the betrayals, the choices he'd made to protect what he'd built. And as he spoke, he realized how much he had been carrying alone, the burden of secrets that had weighed him down for so long. When he finished, Sarah looked at him, her gaze steady and compassionate. "You've built a life that most people would envy," she said quietly. But I see now that it's also a life that isolates you. I can't pretend to understand everything you've gone through, but I want you to know that we're not going anywhere." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. He reached for her hand, gripping it tightly, as though it were the only solid thing left in his world. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "for staying, for trusting me." They sat together in silence, his hand still holding hers, as the night deepened around them. The following weeks were tense, filled with security protocols and late-night phone calls. Ethan had doubled his security, ensuring that every detail of Sarah and Emily's safety was accounted for. He had always been meticulous, but now, with them in his life, his vigilance was relentless. One evening, he received word from Gregory, his investigator, that the threat had been neutralized. The person who had breached his records had been identified, an old business rival looking for leverage, hoping to dismantle Ethan's reputation. With the threat eliminated, Ethan felt a weight lift, a sense of relief he hadn't allowed himself to feel in weeks. That night, he invited Sarah and Emily to his penthouse for a quiet celebration. They spent the evening in his vast living room, watching movies, laughing, enjoying a rare moment of peace. At one point, as they all sat together on the couch, Emily climbed into Ethan's lap, leaning her head against his chest. Ethan wrapped his arms around her, feeling a sense of completeness he had never known. As the night grew late, Emily drifted off to sleep in his arms, and Sarah watched them quietly, her gaze warm and full of understanding. She reached over, placing her hand over Ethan's. "You've given us so much, Ethan," she whispered. "You've made us feel safe. You've made us feel like family." Ethan swallowed hard, his heart full. "You are my family," he replied softly, looking at her. "I didn't know what family could feel like until I met you and Emily. I thought I was protecting you by staying away. But the truth is, I need you." Sarah smiled, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Then stay with us. We don't need your wealth, your power. We just need you, Ethan." He nodded, feeling a wave of gratitude, so intense it left him breathless. In that moment, he realized he was no longer the man he had once been, no longer the man defined by ambition and wealth alone. He had found something greater: love, family, a reason to fight for more than himself. Over time, Ethan made changes to his life, gradually stepping back from the ruthless pursuit that had once driven him. He placed trusted partners in charge of parts of his business, freeing himself from the endless cycle of power struggles and competition. He spent more time with Sarah and Emily, choosing the life he wanted to build with them over the empire he had once been willing to sacrifice everything for. The city continued to bustle around him, the demands of his world still calling, but he had found a new balance. His life was no longer consumed by control and caution. Instead, it was filled with the warmth of laughter, quiet dinners, shared stories, and the feeling of belonging he had thought lost forever. One evening, as he watched Emily playing in the park, her laughter echoing across the playground, he felt a peace settle over him, a peace he had never thought possible. He reached for Sarah's hand, and she squeezed it, sharing a quiet smile. They had found their way to each other, through loss, through fear, through secrets and shadows. And now, at last, they had built something real, something that even the darkest corners of his past could no longer touch. For the first time in years, Ethan looked to the future, and he felt hope, steady and unbreakable, illuminating the path forward. He was home,